The views and opinions expressed on this public access programming do not necessarily represent those of the Hawaii Media family of radio stations. It's time for Sunday morning public access programming on this Hawaii Media radio station.
Good Sunday morning to you. Great to have you along. I'm Johnny Miro on our public access programming each and every Sunday at 9 a.m. on our 6 Oahu stations at 101.1 FM, 101.5 FM, 103.9 FM, 107.5 FM, 96.7 FM, and 97.1 FM. Joined once again by a member of the great crew at the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. This time would be once again joining us Policy Director Malia Hill. Good morning to you, Malia.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, very interesting topic because you would figure, what? You need licenses. It makes everything better and safer. But is it burdensome, and do we actually need each and every profession within the state to have a license? As Kayla Iakina, the president of the Grassroots Institute, recently wrote a column, Malia, recommending that many of Hawaii's occupational licensing laws be reformed or repealed. Now, can you tell me a little bit about what occupational licensing laws are in the first place?
Absolutely. Effectively, a license is like a permission slip from the government that you need in order to legally work in certain professions. What the license requires, it varies depending on the profession, but generally, as a rule, they're required by law and they involve some amount of training or education, an exam or multiple exams, and fees, obviously. So, we know about licenses when we're talking about doctors and dentists, things like that, but occupational licensing is much, much broader than just, doctors and nurses and medical licensing, what we're familiar with. Depending on the state, there can be licenses for everything from nurses to interior decorators to florists. It's a really wide category.
So, no, thanks, Malia. These are laws that limit who can do certain jobs, correct?
Exactly. It's not enough that you have the skills to do something like braid hair or apply makeup. You also have to be able to afford the licensing requirements, and that can be hundreds or thousands of hours of education, which also costs money, and then again you have the fees and requirements set out by the state. Mm-hmm. If you try to do, hair braiding, flower arranging, whatever it is, without a license, you can get fined. Sometimes you can even end up in jail, depending on, what the law says. And, these are really hard on lower income workers especially.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do most states have similar laws? And if so, how do Hawaii's occupational licensing laws stack up against those other states?
Well, it's true. All 50 states and the District of Columbia have some kind of licensing laws affecting a wide variety of occupations, but it's not exactly equal across every state. So the Institute for Justice does a sort of survey of every licensing regime in the country. And their most recent one just came out just a month or so ago. And they found more than 2,700 licensing requirements for 102 lower income jobs across all 50 states and the district. Now I'm not talking about doctors and dentists and lawyers here. We're talking about floor sanders and florists and hair braiders and barbers, that kind of thing. Anyway, when they do the state-by-state comparison, they found that Hawaii was the fourth worst in the nation for occupational licensing. Hawaii had licensing requirements for about 63% of those lower income jobs, about 64 of them, and the highest overall burden. That means 972 days on average in Hawaii lost to education and experience to get that license, as opposed to the national average of about 350 days. And then the average fees associated with a license in Hawaii, it's $506 versus an average of $284. So that basically made Hawaii fourth worst overall, and the worst in terms of the burden put on people who are trying to get a license.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Policy Director Malia Hill from the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, grassrootsinstitute.org for more, grassrootsinstitute.org for more. And what's the alleged purpose of these laws, Malia, versus their practical effect?
Well, whenever someone proposes a license or, explains why licenses for this or that job need to exist, we're always told this is about public health, public safety, protecting the public. But it's pretty obvious that there's more to it than that. That's not really the sole purpose because, some of these professions that have license requirements, you can't really make a strong claim that they have much to do with health or safety. In Hawaii, travel agents and bill collectors have to be licensed. And, you're not looking at a public health issue with travel agents. So it's really more like protectionism, a way to keep competition out of the market, and it ends up denying some people the right to work.
Sounds like you're saying these laws do little to protect the public safety or welfare, more so from unscrupulous professionals. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, and basically what I'm saying is that, if you're trying to protect the public, licensing laws, especially for these, specific kinds of occupations we're talking about, are really not the right tool. There's less restrictive ways to protect the public from fraud and unscrupulous actors, whether they're licensed or not, because, there's no guarantee that a license is going to keep you from an unscrupulous person. So the idea that protecting the public is the reason to have a licensing law, it just doesn't make sense. For example, there's a lot of variation across the country between different states for their licensing requirements. Some states have been taking away licensing requirements for, hair braiding or florists. And so, there's 32 states where you don't have to have a license to be a hair braider, 14 states where you don't need a license for a makeup artist, 18 states where you don't have to get a license to be a shampooer. All three of those things require licenses in Hawaii. But, in those states, no one's avoiding salons because of the threat to health and safety. Mm-hmm. This health and safety argument, it just really doesn't hold water.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. All right, so the pros, the cons of occupational licensing, that's the discussion this morning. Malia, what about the economic downsides? What is the evidence against them?
Well, I think that one thing that we really need to remember is that when we're talking about who suffers most under licensing, it's really the people the workers who would have to go through this, overcome this burden, this barrier, before they can even start earning money and start working. I've been focusing on cosmetology, so I'm just going to stick with that. Mm-hmm. The average cost of cosmetology school nationwide is $16,000. So if you're in Hawaii and you want to braid hair, and you don't even go to cosmetology school to do that, you learned it from your auntie or, a family member because it's, sort of a cultural family thing. You still need to go. You need to spend $16,000 or more to get that degree so that you can get your cosmetology license. And so, licensees start out with more education debt, and they've been doing research, and they found that licensees don't even really make back the full cost of their licenses through higher wages than those that don't have them. It's just a bad financial deal. And that's just, how it hurts the individual worker. You could also make the argument that it's bad for our economy as a whole. Licenses are keeping people out of work, and they prevent them from opening small businesses. They're just a tax on a lower-income worker who, wants the freedom to just make money and make a living for themselves. There's a 2018 study that estimated that licensing costs the national economy about 2 million jobs each year. So, in a small sense, we're hurting the individual person, the individual worker. And in the larger sense, it's not a good thing for our economy.
Okay. Malia Hill from the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, grassrootinstitute.org for more. And here's the big question. Who oversees licenses? Who gets to determine that if you're a hair braider, you have to pass an exam or pay some kind of a fee? Is that the legislature, the governor's office, someone else? Who is it?
Well, the actual decision about, this should have a license, this should not, generally comes from the state legislature. For example, in 2019, the Hawaii legislature passed a law to regulate midwives, which basically introduced a new kind of licensing for midwives. But in terms of, who decides what the requirements are and oversees all that, that actually comes from appointed licensing boards.
Okay. Talk about the abolishing of licensing, but what about the doctors, the lawyers, the architects? Do you think doctors should be able to practice without a medical license?
When I'm talking about getting rid of licenses, I'm really mostly talking about these licenses that are a burden on workers, and they have no health or safety element, like hair braiders and makeup artists. But I do think it's an interesting question that you raised, and I do think we should have a discussion about whether the licensing requirements for doctors and nurses have affected our healthcare shortages. There is a point where too much regulation, too high a licensing burden reduces the number of doctors and nurses in practice. You're not getting enough of a public benefit out of it. So, I think there are ways, short of getting rid of medical licenses, which, let me just forestall the angry response. I'm not suggesting getting rid of medical licenses altogether, but there are ways that we could ease the licensing burden for doctors and nurses who want to practice in Hawaii.
So it sounds like you want to see some type of reform. So what kind of licensing reforms would you like to see, Malia?
There's a couple of different ways that we could go about it. I think the first and most obvious is just reviewing the licensing scheme that we have in Hawaii and getting rid of those licensing requirements that are unnecessary, like hair braiding. The Hawaii auditor has reviewed our licenses and even recommended against licensing requirements for the beauty industry. And yet we still have all of that. It would also help if we stopped creating more licenses, at least if there was no, data-based evidence that it was really needed to protect, the public health and safety. The other thing we could do is try to increase the portability of licenses, letting people from other states who have a valid license practice or do their job in Hawaii, something called universal licensing recognition, where you basically say that you recognize other states' licenses as valid, regardless of what that state's license requirements may be. There are other states that are doing this. Arizona did it in 2019, and ever since they've issued 4,700 licenses to workers who've moved in to Arizona from other states.
Okay. Malia Hill from the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii. Johnny, and I've heard a bit about interstate licensing compacts. Now, what are they and how do they change licensing?
The licensing compacts, that's a little different. It's similar to licensing recognition, but they tend to be something you go to for more complicated kinds of licenses, like doctors and nurses and psychologists. It varies by compact because it's sort of an interstate agreement, but what they do in essence is the participating states agree to streamline licensing among themselves in order to allow qualified applicants to practice across state lines. Sometimes it's literally you can just go to another state practice. Sometimes it's more like there's an expedited method to get your license recognized in that state.
So could the interstate compacts help Hawaii's healthcare problems, you think?
Well, I think that is a real possibility. We know that Hawaii has to do something to address our shortage in healthcare workers, and the interstate compacts could be the key. We could either pursue licensing recognition, like I mentioned earlier, or join something like the Nursing Licensure Compact or the Interstate Medical Licensing Compact.
It kind of sounds a little similar to what the Governor Ige, did during the coronavirus crisis. He used the emergency powers, remember, to allow out-of-state health workers to work here in Hawaii, right? Did we see any problems with those workers? And did they provide lower quality care?
That's a really good example because Ige's COVID orders, his measures, they really were a sort of temporary license recognition. So long as you had a license in good standing in another state and a local health facility was willing to sort of take you on and take responsibility for you as a doctor or a nurse, or, it actually applied to a whole bevy of healthcare workers, but any of those things, you could basically get this temporary permission to practice in Hawaii. And like you say, there were no issues of quality or safety with this at all. And in fact, after it expired, the Healthcare Association of Hawaii lobbied Ige just back in August to reissue that order so they could bring out-of-state nurses in to help with the staffing shortages and the stress on Hawaii hospitals. And the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs just extended that, maybe last week, I think it was. They've extended that program for 3 more months. So effectively, we've been operating with a sort of license recognition for nurses, at least, for a while, and it hasn't caused any problems. It just really shows that this is a good path forward.
Yeah, it sure does. Malia Hill, so with all this evidence, who favors licensing, and what are the chances we see licensing reform during the upcoming legislative cycle?
Well, not to be super cynical, but generally the people who favor licensing are those, either the people who just like regulation because they just like regulation, or the people who benefit from the current system. For example, I mentioned the Hawaii auditor earlier. They did a research and they came out with a study saying you don't need beauty industry licenses. It's unnecessary. And in response, the Hawaii Board of Barbering and Cosmetology issued this ominous warning that if we delicense, beauty industry professionals, it would open the door to fraud, incompetence, and public distrust in barbers and cosmetologists. So who favors licensing? The people who benefit from licensing. To be fair to the medical community, however, since doctors and nurses have come into this discussion too, I have seen multiple healthcare organizations and advocacy groups in Hawaii, and not to mention doctors and nurses individually, they've pushed for reform and even suggested that Hawaii join one of these interstate compacts. So it's not, universally everyone who benefits from keeping people out favors licensing. It really kind of depends.
So it sounds it does sound like the upcoming legislative cycle, nothing is going to get done with this, or maybe even brought up.
Well, I'll be optimistic.
Okay.
Let's end on that optimistic note on the upcoming legislative session. We have a bunch of new people. Well, we have some new people in. So yes, we have to wait and see. And, change can move slowly in Hawaii, but my hope is that this experience with the, sort of de facto temporary licensing recognition for nurses at least persuades legislators to look into some kind of license recognition or interstate compact to address the doctor shortage and the nursing shortage, the medical professional shortage in general. And I do think, hey, while they're at it, since they're looking at licenses for doctors, then it just kind of makes sense. Why not look at licenses for, other lower income professions? It would be a good way to help the economy, advance worker freedom, and just re-examine the necessity of some of these licenses, like the hair braiders, and, maybe even think about a universal recognition bill.
That's Malia Hill from Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, been covering the topic occupational licensing laws here in the state of Hawaii. Keli'i Akina, the president of Grassroot Institute, recently wrote a column on that, and you can find out what he had to say at grassrootinstitute.org, grassrootinstitute.org. Malia, thanks for all the great information, all the insight. I'm sure people learned a lot from this. And I'll tell you, last thing, happy holidays to you, and I hope to be speaking to you soon, sometime in the new year.
Happy holidays to you all, too, and I hope to speak to you again soon myself.
The views and opinions.